The case model provides schools with a process to provide personalised learning to all students. Now let's systematically look at each step in the case model. In step 1, teachers are reminded that they need to plan and teach the year level or age appropriate content descriptions. To implement the first stage of the case model, teachers need to follow 7 steps. In the remainder of this section of the professional learning module, we'll look at the 7 steps being practically implemented with content descriptions from Australian Curriculum version 9. Now let's have a look at the 7 steps being implemented with an example from Year 9 Australian Curriculum English. Teachers start the process by collaboratively determining the content descriptions from version 9 of the Australian curriculum that will be taught and modelled to their students. Teachers then highlight the key terminology and cognitive verbs to be taught in the content descriptions. I find it easier if you highlight each of the key terms in different colours. This helps the teachers differentiate the key terminology and skills that need to be taught to their students. Teachers now need to define the key terminologies and cognitive verbs they highlighted in the previous step. It is important to define the key terminology and cognitive verbs to ensure that teachers are not teaching superfluous knowledge or demonstrating superfluous skills not in the content descriptions. To define the key terminology and cognitive verbs, teachers need to go to the glossary associated with the learning area. If the terminology is not in that glossary, rather than making it up yourself or finding it somewhere else, it's important to go to the glossaries of other learning areas in the Australian curriculum. By using the Australian curriculum definitions in the glossaries, teachers are ensuring they teach the Australian curriculum in a rigorous way. Teachers can further flesh out the content descriptions by looking at the elaborations on the Australian Curriculum website. Whilst all the elaborations are optional, they do give teachers boundaries of kind of what is acceptable in relation to the content descriptions. By defining the key terminology and cognitive verbs and looking at the elaborations in the content descriptions, teachers collaboratively can determine what is the essential knowledge they need to teach in relation to the content descriptions. Teachers can also use the definitions of the key terminology and cognitive verbs, as well as the optional elaborations, to collaboratively determine the essential skills in the content descriptions to be modelled to students. Once the teachers have collaboratively determined the essential knowledge and the essential skills, these are added to the planning template used by a school or educational systems jurisdiction. If appropriate, the teachers collaboratively develop scaffolds to model the skills in the content descriptions. In step 2 of the case model, teachers collaboratively need to identify the abilities of all their students. By identifying the strengths and barriers to learning or functional impacts of their students, they can target their support to provide personalised learning. To implement stage 2 of the case model, teachers need to collaboratively follow 5 steps. Once they follow these 5 steps, they're universally designed. Pedagogical strategies and the adjustments that have been identified need to be applied to the relevant planning process used by the school or educational system jurisdiction. To implement the abilities element of the case model, the first step teachers need to collaboratively do is determine the common characteristics, strengths, and barriers to learning, otherwise referred to as functional impacts, of all the students in their class. We begin this process by identifying the common characteristics we see in our classroom. We're not thinking about individual students at this stage. We're thinking about everyone in our classroom. We're thinking about what are those common things that we see that connect students. In this example, we're seeing varying levels of literacy and varying levels of engagement. We use the word varying because if I write low literacy, that automatically becomes negative and it's hard to find strengths. If I write disengagement, it is also negative and it's really hard to find strengths. By using the term varying, we can look at what are the strengths associated with these common characteristics and what are the barriers to learning, otherwise referred to as functional impacts. Now that we've identified the common characteristics, we think about what are the associated strengths related to those common characteristics, and we map those out. Once again, we're thinking about all students in our classroom, not simply individual students with disability or diverse learning needs. We're thinking about everyone we see in front of us in our room. We now think about the barriers to learning or functional impacts associated with these common characteristics. We started with strengths, so we have a growth mindset, but we also need to identify what are those potential barriers to learning that are associated with those common characteristics. Once teachers have identified the common characteristics, strengths, and barriers to learning, otherwise referred to as functional impacts of all the students in their class, they need to know the Universal Design for Learning framework and apply it. The Universal Design for Learning framework, developed by Harvard University, is a problem-solving tool, not a set of strategies. When we look at the framework, it looks like a lot of work. There is no teacher that could do everything in the framework. It's a way of overcoming barriers to learning for students. I like to think of it like a restaurant menu. If I go to a restaurant and feel like an Italian dish, I choose an Italian dish on the menu. I don't choose everything. When I'm planning with teachers and we talk about potential barriers for students to the learning process, we don't use everything in framework. We look at the framework and we pick and choose what we're going to use to help problem solve approaches to support our students to access their barriers to learning. Put simply, the Universal Design for Learning framework consists of principles, guidelines, and checkpoints. Each of the 3 columns are broad principles in the Universal Design for Learning framework. They're broad ways of overcoming barriers to learning for students. Within each one of those principles are 3 rectangular boxes. They're referred to as guidelines. Guidelines are still broad approaches, but a bit more targeted than the general principles. Within each guideline or rectangular box, there are dot points. Each one of those dot points is referred to as a checkpoint. Those checkpoints are very targeted ways to overcome students' barriers to the learning process. Once again, they're not strategies to implement in a classroom. They give you ideas of how to support students to overcome their barriers to the learning process. Then students are supported by many different strategies. That's what I like about the Universal Design for Learning framework. Teachers can pick and choose the strategies they like as long as it meets the outcomes of those checkpoints. The Universal Design for Learning framework has been named in the Nationally Consistent Collection of Data for Students with Disability, and this is the definition that the federal government has used for teachers in Australia. When we think about the Universal Design for Learning framework and planning with teachers, we can ask ourselves 3 general questions during the planning process. The first question I encourage teachers to ask is, am I providing students with multiple ways of engaging in the learning process? The second question relates to the content descriptions in the Australian curriculum. Teachers are encouraged to ask themselves, am I representing the knowledge and skills in the approved curriculum to my students in multiple ways? The final question relates to the achievement standards in the Australian curriculum. Teachers need to ask themselves, am I allowing my students to provide evidence of learning against the approved curriculum in multiple ways? Now let's have a look more specifically at the Universal Design for Learning framework. So the green column is Principle 1, the idea that I engage kids in the learning process in multiple ways. The framework suggests to engage students in the learning process in multiple ways, we first need to recruit their interest. We need to support them to get interested in the learning process. Each one of the dot points within that guideline gives you specific ways of supporting students to recruit their interest in the learning process. Once teachers have recruited students' interest in the learning process, Guideline 2 in the Universal Design for Learning framework encourages teachers to think about how they support students to sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process. Each one of the dot points within that guideline provides more targeted ways of supporting students to sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process. The Universal Design for Learning framework is a hierarchy. If students are struggling with sustaining effort and persistence in the learning process, teachers need to come back to an earlier element of the framework and ask, have I recruited students' interest in the learning process? If not, they need to think about supporting that first before coming back to supporting them to sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process. The final guideline in Principle 1 relates to supporting students with self-regulation. Once again, the dot points within this guideline provide more targeted ways of supporting students with self-regulation. The Universal Design for Learning framework is developed on a hierarchy approach. So before students can engage in self-regulation, we first need to support them to recruit their interest, then sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process. Then we support self-regulation. If a student is struggling with self-regulation, rather than continue to focus on that even though they're struggling, we need to come back and ask ourselves, can they sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process? If not, have we recruited their interest in the learning process? When representing the knowledge and skills in the content descriptors to students in multiple ways, teachers need to first think about, can all kids physically access the information being taught and the skills being modelled? In Guideline 1 of Principle 2 of the Universal Design for Learning framework, this is referred to as perception. Within this guideline, each of the dot points gives more specific and targeted ways of supporting students to access the information being taught and the skills being modelled. Once all students can physically access the information being taught and skills being modelled, Guideline 2 of Principle 2 in the Universal Design for Learning framework reminds teachers that they need to clarify all language and symbols used in information. This is because if students can't physically access the information, then understand the language and symbols being used in it, they can never comprehend the information being taught to them. The final guideline in Principle 2 talks about supporting students with comprehension. However, before students can demonstrate comprehension and be supported by teachers to do comprehension, teachers first need to ask, can all students physically access the information being taught, and have they clarified all the language and symbols being used? If a student struggles with comprehension, rather than continue to focus on comprehension, the teacher needs to ask him or herself, can all students understand the language and symbols being used in the information? If not, can all students physically access the information? In Principle 3 of the Universal Design for Learning framework, teachers are encouraged to let all students physically demonstrate the achievement standards first before they demonstrate it any other way. Once the teacher has allowed all students to physically demonstrate what they know and can do, the teacher is then encouraged to support them with their expression and communication and communicating their knowledge and understanding and skills in multiple ways. The final guideline in Principle 3 of the Universal Design for Learning framework relates to executive functioning. It reminds teachers that they need to support students with executive functioning. And it also reminds them it's a hierarchy in terms of students demonstrating their learning. Students first need to be able to physically demonstrate what they can do before they can express it and communicate it through writing and other means. And then once they can do that, then they can demonstrate executive functioning. So if a student is struggling with executive functioning, then the teacher, rather than continue to focus on that, the first question is, can my students demonstrate their knowledge and skills through expression and communication? If not, can they physically demonstrate their learning first? With the knowledge of their students' common characteristics, associated strengths, and associated barriers to learning, teachers look at the Universal Design for Learning framework, then select checkpoints that they believe would be useful in supporting the students to overcome their barriers to the learning process and leverage their strengths to access that learning process. As the Universal Design for Learning framework is a problem-solving tool, not a set of strategies, once the teacher has identified the Universal Design for Learning checkpoints that would be useful for overcoming their students' barriers to the learning process and leveraging their strengths, they now need to identify pedagogical strategies that they could use within the classroom to support their students. To support a school or educational system's nationally consistent collection of data for students with disability evidence, a group of teachers could include the students with disabilities initials in brackets next to both the associated barriers to learning, otherwise referred to as functional impact, and Tier 1 strategies. This would allow someone who looks at the document to identify what is put in place for students with disability within a classroom. Now it's time for the teacher to think about specific students with disability and diverse learning needs within their class. They do the same processes for the whole class, but now they're thinking about the individual characteristics of students, the individual strengths, and the individual barriers to learning, otherwise referred to as functional impacts. Now we're going to look at how to complete the process using a hypothetical student. The first step is we think about what are the individual student characteristics that we see within the classroom. Once we've identified the student's individual characteristics, we then need to think about what are the strengths associated with these individual characteristics. This is because when we think about strengths, we can use these to leverage the learning process and to access the learning process for students with disability and diverse learning needs. Once we've identified a student's strengths, we then need to think about what are the barriers to learning or functional impacts associated with that individual student's characteristics. Now that we've identified the individual strengths and functional impacts for specific students with disability and diverse learning needs within our classrooms, we need to consider the instructional adjustments and environmental adjustments and curriculum adjustments that we could use to support them to access the learning process. In the third step of the case model, teachers are reminded that students will demonstrate along the spectrum of achievement standards from foundation through to year 10. As such, it is important to deconstruct the achievement standard for the student's chronological age or year level, as well as any targeted achievement standards for specific students with disability or diverse learning needs. To implement the third stage of the case model, teachers need to collaboratively follow 8 steps. Now let's have a look at the steps being implemented with an example from Year 9 Australian Curriculum English. Firstly, teachers need to collaboratively determine which chronological age or year level achievement standards from version 9 their students will be assessed against. Teachers then highlight the key terminology and cognitive verbs in the achievement standards they have selected. The key terminology and cognitive verbs are then collaboratively defined by the teachers using the Australian curriculum glossaries. To further flesh out the achievement standards, teachers then can collaboratively look at the content descriptors and optional elaborations. These will help the teachers determine what the students need to demonstrate as evidence of learning against the achievement standards. After teachers collaboratively define the key terminology and cognitive verbs using the glossaries and also look at the content descriptions and optional elaborations, they need to talk about what students need to demonstrate and not demonstrate as evidence of learning against the achievement standards. Once teachers have determined what the students need to demonstrate as evidence of learning against the achievement standards, this is the opportunity to develop any scaffolds to support students to provide this evidence of learning. Now, teachers move from thinking about their whole class to individual students with disability and diverse learning needs who are demonstrating their learning at a different achievement standard level. The teachers need to collaboratively determine which level, either below or above, their student is working at so they can follow the same process of deconstructing the achievement standards. In this example, a student with disability or diverse learning needs is working at an achievement standard below the achievement standard for the chronological age or year level of the class. Once the targeted achievement standards have been identified, deconstructed using the glossary, as well as the content descriptions and optional elaborations, it is important for the teachers to collaboratively determine what are the similarities between the targeted achievement standard and the achievement standard for the student's year level, as well as the differences between the targeted achievement standard and the achievement standard for the student's year level.